She wasn't leaving without a fight. Teresa Marshall clenched her fists around a folder of evidence, her pulse hammering as the courtroom air thickened with tension. The officer's voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "Ma'am, you need to leave. Now." The judge had spoken. The order was final. But Teresa had spent months preparing for this moment, gathering proof of the discrimination that had upended her career. Walking out meant being silenced, erased. She couldn't let that happen. Sergeant Kyle Harrington, tall and imposing, moved toward her. His badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a symbol of the authority he was ready to enforce. Teresa's breath hitched. This wasn't just about her job anymore. This was about justice, about refusing to be dismissed like she never mattered. Then, before the officer could take another step, the heavy courtroom doors slammed open. A clerk, breathless and gripping a folded note, rushed inside. "Your Honor, there's a call for you." From the White House. The room fell into stunned silence. Teresa's heart pounded. This fight wasn't over. Not even close. Welcome to New Real Life Stories, where truth is stranger than fiction. Stay with us because what happens next will leave you speechless. Teresa Marshall sat stiffly in the courtroom, her hands gripping a stack of carefully prepared documents. Her heart pounded, each beat reminding her of what was at stake. She had spent months preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, reliving painful memories, and convincing herself that justice was worth the fight. Yet now, with the judge's cold stare fixed on her, she felt the crushing weight of an unspoken truth. Some battles are lost before they even begin. Across the room, the opposing attorney smirked, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing inside her. He wasn't worried. Why would he be? The system wasn't built to protect people like her. It was built to dismiss them. But Teresa wasn't going to let that happen. Not this time. She squared her shoulders, taking a steadying breath as her attorney, Rick Stanton, presented the final piece of evidence. "Your Honor, my client has uncovered additional emails proving deliberate discrimination against her in the workplace. We request that this evidence be admitted before closing arguments." Judge Hessington barely glanced at him before raising a hand. "Mr. Stanton, you've had ample time to present your case. The court will not entertain further disruptions." Teresa's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a rejection of evidence. It was a dismissal of her entire fight. Her voice, her proof, her truth. None of it mattered here. "Your Honor, please," Teresa tried again, rising from her seat. "This evidence is critical." "You are out of order, Ms. Marshall," the judge snapped, her tone like ice. "Sit down or be removed." A sharp silence cut through the room. Teresa looked to Rick, who gave her a warning glance, but she couldn't stop now. If she backed down, her case was dead. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady, "I have the right to present this evidence." The judge slammed her gavel. "Sergeant, remove her." The words felt like a slap. The courtroom murmured as Sergeant Kyle Harrington, a tall, broad-shouldered officer with an air of practiced authority, stepped forward. His footsteps were deliberate, his gaze impassive. He had done this before, escorted countless people out of courtrooms, enforced rules without question. To him, she was just another disruption. "Ma'am, I need you to leave. Now." His voice was firm but not unkind. Teresa's pulse roared in her ears. Her entire case, everything she had fought for, was crumbling. Being dragged out would only reinforce the idea that she was the problem, not the victim. She opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, the doors burst open. A court clerk, breathless and gripping a folded note, rushed toward the bench. "Your Honor," she gasped. There's a call for you." From the White House. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. For the first time that morning, Judge Hessington hesitated. The gavel, still gripped in her hand, remained motionless. Even Sergeant Harrington stopped mid-step, his eyes flickering with confusion. "The White House," the judge repeated, as if she had misheard. "Yes, Your Honor," the clerk confirmed, still catching her breath. "They insist on speaking with you immediately." The judge's expression darkened. She turned sharply and disappeared into her chambers without another word. Teresa exhaled shakily. What just happened? The judge had been moments away from kicking her out. Now the most powerful office in the country was suddenly interested in her case. She exchanged a bewildered look with Rick, but he was just as stunned. Across the room, the opposing attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His confidence had slipped, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. The moment the judge vanished behind closed doors, hushed whispers erupted throughout the courtroom. Sergeant Harrington, still standing near Teresa, cleared his throat. He looked like a man caught in the middle of something much bigger than he had anticipated. "Stay where you are," he muttered before stepping back. Teresa barely heard him. Her mind was racing. Why would the White House care about her case? She wasn't famous. She wasn't wealthy. She was just a woman who refused to be ignored. Minutes passed like hours. Then the door to the judge's chambers swung open. Judge Hessington returned, her expression unreadable. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath as she walked back to her seat. "Ms. Marshall," she said, her voice measured, careful. "Please return to your seat." Teresa hesitated. Was this a trap? Even Sergeant Harrington looked puzzled. But Teresa's gut told her this was an opportunity she couldn't ignore. She sat, gripping the edge of the table as Judge Hessington cleared her throat. After further review, the judge said, choosing her words cautiously, "This court will allow Ms. Marshall to present her additional evidence." A ripple of shock spread through the room. The opposing attorney shot up from his chair. "Your Honor, I object." "Overruled," Hessington snapped. "Counselor, you will remain silent unless called upon." The attorney's jaw clenched, but he sat down, his confidence shattered. Teresa's hands trembled as she handed Rick the evidence. A few minutes ago, she had been on the verge of being erased. Now she had a real chance. Rick wasted no time. He projected the damning emails on the screen. Messages laced with coded language about Teresa's urban style and how she wasn't a cultural fit for leadership. The courtroom murmured in disgust. Hessington, who had previously seemed indifferent, now looked troubled. "These emails," Rick stated, "show clear bias." Ms. Marshall was passed over for promotions, targeted, and eventually pushed out, not because of her performance, but because of the color of her skin. The opposing attorney scrambled for a rebuttal, but the damage was done. The evidence spoke for itself. As the hearing continued, Teresa felt something shift, not just in the courtroom but in herself. She wasn't just fighting for her job anymore. She was fighting for every person who had been dismissed, overlooked, silenced. The trial adjourned with a promise of further review. But outside the courthouse, reporters were already waiting. News had spread about the White House's involvement, and suddenly, Teresa's case was national news. Standing on the courthouse steps, Teresa took a deep breath. She had come here alone, ready to be ignored. Now the whole country was listening. Teresa sat quietly in her living room, the glow of the television casting flickering shadows on the walls. News anchors recounted the case that had once seemed impossible to win. The marketing firm had not only settled but was now facing deeper investigations. Policies were changing. People were paying attention. She traced the edges of the DOJ commendation letter on the table, its weight symbolic of everything she had fought for. Months ago, she had walked into that courtroom fearing she would be erased. Today, she knew her voice had carried farther than she ever imagined. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about making sure no one else would be silenced the way she almost had been. The fight wasn't over, but now she understood her power. Outside, the sky stretched wide, painted in soft hues of dusk. Teresa took a deep breath, feeling lighter than she had in years. Her story had been heard. And maybe, just maybe, it had changed something. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Help amplify real stories that make a difference.